Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Environment at Risk, the changed environmental landscape under the Trump administration. This is a webinar for journalists and students from the Resilience Media Project at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. I'm Dale Willman. The goal of the Resilience Media Project is to help journalists in their coverage of systemic grand challenges, such as pandemics and climate risk. Right now, we do that by giving journalists tools to better cover issues surrounding these topics and to show them how to better envision stories that look towards solutions. The last 4 years have been quite a ride for journalists who cover the environment. During that time, the Trump administration has attempted to roll back some 100 environmental rules and regulations. A concerted effort has been made to strike the words climate change from government documents. Scientists who work in the climate arena, as well as those involved in virus research, have been intimidated and even fired simply for doing their jobs. And late in 2019, which seems so long ago in COVID time, a bipartisan report from New York University said the country's environment had reached a crisis point under this administration, with almost weekly violations of what are considered to be respected safeguards. We're going to talk about all of this today and much more, and we'll discuss what the upcoming election may mean for the environment, but mostly we want to hear from you, your thoughts and your questions. We're using Zoom Webinar, which allows you to participate through the Q&A option on your software. The chat function has been turned off for viewers. We'll only be putting links up there for you to check out. So please ask your questions in Q&A. And now that you can vote on questions, know that you can vote on questions that you like, helping them to rise to the top of the queue where they'll be answered first. We'll have a brief presentation from our guests and then go right to your questions. Joining us today is Lauren Kurtz. Lauren is the Executive Director of the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. The fund offers help to scientists who are threatened, harassed, or attacked because of their work. I'm particularly grateful to have Maria Caffrey with us. Maria is a climate scientist and a former partner with the National Park Service. She'll share her story of trying to release a climate report and facing opposition. But first, we're going to hear from Romany Webb. Romany is a senior fellow and associate research scholar with the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at the Columbia Law School. She's going to talk about a great tool for journalists, the Silencing Science Tracker. Romany, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dale, and hi, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all. Less than 2 weeks from the election, which, as everybody knows, the results of which will have really profound implications for climate science and climate regulation, not just for the next 4 years, but really long term. It is, of course, no secret that the Trump administration does not see action on climate change as a priority. I think we heard that again last night in the president's remarks at the debate. Over the last 4 years, on many occasions, the administration has been openly hostile to climate regulation. And as sort of Dale alluded to, rather than listening to the advice of and instruction of scientists who tell us that we are in the midst of a climate crisis and that we should be urgently and dramatically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the administration has really pandered to the fossil fuel industry. At one point, it even went so far as to direct the Environmental Protection Agency, which is charged with protecting public health and the environment, to prioritize work on actions that had been proposed or supported by the industry. And unsurprisingly, many of those actions involved weakening or eliminating climate protections. So at the Sabin Center, we have been tracking the Trump administration's attempts to roll back climate protections in what we call our climate deregulation tracker. It currently has 163 entries, and that reflects 163 steps taken by the Trump administration to dismantle climate regulations. So far, they've completed their dismantling of about 70 climate and other environmental regulations, and they're working on dismantling another 30. Of course, many of those Trump administration actions have been challenged in the courts, and actually the court challenges have been really quite successful. Early on in the administration, we saw a number of courts striking down Trump administration attempts to delay the implementation of regulations that had been adopted during the Obama administration. More recently, we've seen successful court challenges to Trump administration attempts to weaken or eliminate those same regulations. Most of those challenges have been brought on procedural grounds. Basically, the courts have found that the administration didn't follow the legally mandated process, or that its analysis was in some way inadequate or flawed. Basically, that the administration did a shoddy job. And incidentally, just as a point of information, the Sabin Center also tracks those and other climate cases in what we call our climate change litigation database. We have two sort of subsections of that, one that focuses on US cases, of which we have about 1,200, and the other focuses on international cases, of which we have about 400. So given this large body of case law and the court decisions striking down a lot of these actions, I think it's fair to say that the law has been relatively effective in constraining the worst of the Trump administration's attacks on climate regulation. Unfortunately, as we'll talk about more today, I think the law has been much less effective in constraining the Trump administration's attacks on climate science. And the attacks on climate science and the attacks on climate regulation are, of course, very closely related, because the Trump administration's regulatory actions are largely at odds with the science about what the scientists are telling us about climate change and the need to address it. And so faced with that contradiction, the Trump administration has sought to hide the science, or where it can't do that, has just downplayed it or ignored it. So again, we keep track of those efforts in collaboration with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund in what we call our Silencing Science Tracker. It records federal, state, and local government attempts to prevent or restrict scientific research, discussion, and education. So far, since the November 2016 election, we have recorded over 300 anti-science actions taken by the federal government. It's about 2 per week since President Trump was elected. Things like, as Dale said, censoring scientific research and researchers, cutting funding for scientific research, reassigning or even firing scientists to prevent them conducting research, and more, I think, subtle attempts to, for example, interfere with the design or the conduct of scientific research. This has happened at a remarkably broad range of federal agencies. Nearly 24 federal agencies have been involved. As you might expect, the worst offenders are the EPA and the Department of the Interior, but we've also seen a lot of anti-science behavior at the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, NOAA, NASA, and of course, recently at the Department of Health and Human Services. So I think Lauren is going to give a couple of concrete examples and talk about really how the law has or hasn't applied and helped to protect scientists. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
A quick question. You had talked about the success of these lawsuits, but many of them are procedural. So we'll talk a little bit later about what another 4 years might look like, either under Vice President Biden or President Trump. But if Trump wins re-election, is this a stopgap, these procedural challenges? And does that allow them to change those procedures and the way that they apply these things, and could possibly have a larger effect?
Absolutely. I think we can expect to see, if Trump wins a second term, administration officials and these agencies going back and re-looking at those rules that have been struck down, re-issuing rules that are substantially the same, but they've complied with the legal hoops, so they don't face the same sorts of challenges.
Okay, so we'll talk more about that later in the webinar. So Lauren, can you expand on what we've heard from Romani so far?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So as Romani said, our Silencing Science Tracker has noted quite a number of incidents where the government has attempted, many times successfully, to silence science. My organization, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, works with some of these scientists to contest these actions. And unfortunately, one of the big takeaways that we've had from the Silencing Science Tracker is that the incidents that have occurred oftentimes don't really have an effective legal response. A lot of the laws and policies that might apply to these situations, unfortunately, I think there was a real failure of imagination when they were written, and the ways that we've seen them play out in the Trump administration, oftentimes there's just not really an effective way to fight back against what's been occurring. So we'll hear later from scientist Dr. Maria Caffrey, who experienced a pretty egregious attempt to silence science and the ways in which the legal system was ineffectual. at least so far, in being able to fix the issues that she faced. Another example from the Silencing Science Tracker, you may remember a few years ago that EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt made some public statements that carbon dioxide is, in his opinion, not a primary contributor to climate change, which is obviously incorrect. There was a complaint made under the agency scientific integrity policy at EPA. Most scientific agencies do have these things called scientific integrity policies, which were written during the Obama era. And they were intended to protect scientific integrity at agencies, and they have been, in many cases, very effective at issues like plagiarism and research misconduct and some of the more quote unquote traditional areas of scientific malfeasance. But when it comes to things like censorship and political interference, they've oftentimes not been very effective. So in the case of Scott Pruitt making, false statements about the role of CO2 in climate change, the EPA concluded that that was not a violation of EPA's scientific integrity policy. Another incident that you may all remember was the quote unquote Sharpiegate last September, where President Trump incorrectly tweeted that Alabama was one of the states under threat from Hurricane Dorian. The National Weather Service issued a correction, then Trump doubled down with that famous Sharpie weather map. NOAA, the parent agency of the National Weather Service, basically issued a statement supporting Trump's claim, and the media reports said that NOAA basically prevented staffers from issuing any opinion, and that there was political pressure for them to support President Trump's erroneous tweets. There was ultimately a scientific integrity violation into this whole saga, and they did actually find that there was a violation of NOAA's scientific integrity policy, which is great, but it fell short in this regard because even though they did recommend some corrective actions such as creating more policy guidelines and increasing scientific integrity trainings, they didn't actually punish the responsible individuals. So I think that really highlights the ways in which our scientific integrity protections at the federal government have fallen short in the Trump era. Oftentimes these agencies which are policing themselves, there's a political pressure either to not find any sort of integrity violation, or if an integrity violation is found, the response is fairly weak and not particularly meaningful. So one thing that my organization, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, has been working on is trying to make sure that scientific integrity policies can actually live up to their full potential. Unfortunately, as it stands right now, many agency policies don't even address issues like political interference at all. The CDC, for example, doesn't, and I think we've seen in recent months, as is evidenced by our tracker, there's been unfortunately quite a lot of political interference happening at the CDC. There's also a whole other range of issues that are unevenly addressed, like whether scientists can communicate directly to the press, and what should be done regarding conflicts of interest, which are both very important topics. And finally, the adjudication process is very challenging. Every agency does it differently, but it's generally handled in-house, and scientists don't really have any meaningful opportunity to appeal decisions. So in cases like Maria's, where the policy fails, or more accurately, the way the policy is interpreted, I would argue, failed. There's not really a meaningful opportunity for scientists to challenge how that has played out. So concluding with some thoughts on the next administration, it would be great to see additional revisions made to scientific integrity policies that improve the areas covered, creating some clear and effective provisions for enforcement and punishment, and providing scientists with meaningful rights of appeal. So I believe in the chat, we have a link to our model policy on this, and also some guides that we put together for scientists who can utilize the existing policies and some comparisons of agencies where their policies are relatively stronger or relatively weaker. And one final note I'll say is it's important to think about ways that this might also be corrected even if we continue with another 4 years of the Trump administration. One heartening development that I think is worth noting is that there is a Scientific Integrity Act currently pending before the House. So I think that that's something that could potentially progress in the next Congress, especially if there's a shakeup in the Senate as well. I think there's a lot of support right now at the House level, and it would be great to see that pass both the House and the Senate in the next term. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you for that. Maria, I want to hear your story and what happened to you with the National Park Service, but I think it's important that I, in full disclosure, mention that my wife actually works for the Northeast region of the National Park Service. So with that out there, could you tell us what your experience was?
Sure, and I'm so happy to be able to speak about how supportive the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund have been in this. And so I'm here today just to give you an example of the kind of things these scientists can be going through. And so it's a very long story, so I'm going to try and cut it short. But basically in 2018, I was on maternity leave. And while I was on maternity leave, I had a colleague reach out to me to let me know that a project that I had been working on for the National Park Service for over 5 years, a project that was looking at the impact of sea level rise and storm surge on every coastal park in the system, 118 parks, was being edited by somebody that I had never spoken to before, somebody in Washington, very senior in the National Park Service. And this person was editing out of my report any place where I mentioned that humans were the cause of climate change. Now, this wasn't a report that was intended to be political in any way. It's a 70-something page report, and it mentions in about 5 places that humans are the cause of climate change, because that's an essential part of our methods when we talk about this. But what ensued from that was I basically said no, that it was inappropriate to be editing this report to what I felt was lying to the public about humans being the cause of climate change. And so I reached out to the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, and they were incredible in their support in advising me on how to go forward with that. The good news is we were able to stop them from making those edits to my report, and my report came out as it was intended to be released. We followed up by filing a scientific integrity complaint to the National Park Service and the Inspector General because I had encountered a significant amount of pressure to try and edit this report. And the result of that was that they found that there was no violation of scientific integrity. Basically, the National Park Service got caught with their hand in the cookie jar, and it became very public that they were editing this report. And then when they took their hand back out, suddenly that's no violation. So that was a very disturbing period of time. And then roll on to February 2019, my contract was up for renewal. My supervisor had actually recommended me for a promotion. I had glowing reviews. But with a week before my contract was up, we were told that the National Park Service declined to renew my contract, that they didn't have the funds to renew me. Very surprising to everyone involved. And so because it was such short notice, I actually offered to volunteer to wrap up the projects that I was in the middle of. And I was told that they wouldn't even accept me back as a volunteer. So at that point, their excuse that they didn't have the funds to keep me kind of fell apart. And it became very clear that it wasn't about money. It was about the fact that I stood up for scientific integrity in my role as a climate scientist while I was there. So again, Climate Science Legal Defense Fund came to my aid, and we have filed a whistleblower complaint. And I testified to Congress in July 2019 about the kind of pressures that these scientists are going through.
So I want to make a distinction here too. Those familiar with the government, this is old hat, but there are different categories here. There are staff scientists, there are contract scientists. So how you were dealt with in this way, not having your contract renewed, would be different than how someone under in a staff position might be handled. Doesn't mean the intimidation is less, it just means it's different. So can you explain the difference between those two quickly?
That's correct. And one of the things that we found out through this is that really I exist in a kind of gray area as far as employment goes. And it's something that I think we also need to recognize, because as I was testifying to Congress, it turned out even congressmen didn't know that my role existed, which was I would go to the National Park Service every day, work in their office, have a National Park Service supervisor that would do things like approve my vacation time and all of those things, represent them in public events. But rather than paying me a salary in the traditional sense, as you mentioned, there were contracts that they would run through other universities, and then that university would pay me. So it was my supervisor used to joke it was money laundering with wages that we would be putting our money through a university, and then I would be there. But I had never actually even gone to the university that I apparently was employed by. So my designation was a partner, which is a significantly different designation to a contractor. Contractors had a whole different ID and process that they had to go through. I was called a partner, which apparently nobody seems to have any rules for, and no protections, more importantly. So
well, and so the purpose of contracts in one sense is to provide flexibility in staffing for short-term goals, other sorts of things. But the reality of it is it puts a contractor at a particular level of risk. Is that correct, Lauren? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, the last few decades in the federal government, they've really expanded it outside of this, very traditional employer-employment arrangement. And they've done more solutions to work around funding issues and to create collaborations and associations. And the long and the short of it is, it's another area which the law has not caught up on. The whistleblower protections are very uncreative in terms of how they've adapted to the current reality of the federal workforce. And it means that folks like Maria and many other scientists who do things like coordinate with the federal government and universities, which is not at all an uncommon process for a scientist to have multiple hats like that. But the federal laws just are not up to speed on how the federal government, especially the federal government scientists, are currently working these days. And it's really, really frustrating because they're doing the same work. They're in effect in the same situations, but the paperwork behind their jobs is a little different. And so the legal system just throws up its hands.
So let me remind those who are listening that we are using the chat function to put up links and important information for you, but you're not able to use that. We would like to see your questions. Use the Q&A function. If you want to start putting your questions in there, we can turn to questions now. I want to talk briefly about the whole concept of the response to what happened to Maria, the fact that the agencies themselves are able to police their own behavior. And that goes to your whole point that they said, oh, well, we published it, so no harm, no foul. Lauren, do you want to talk about that, about the way that agencies are able to manage it in this sense, and what that means for any sort of true oversight?
Yeah, I mean, it's very frustrating in a couple of ways. I mean, one is obviously that agencies are policing themselves, which I think in an era like today is obviously a very challenging situation. And the truth of the matter is, I think many agency scientific integrity officers are doing the best they can, but they're in an impossible situation. And it's really important for us to have more independent oversight and ability for scientific integrity officers to be able to act without fear of retribution against themselves. So we need a situation or a system that provides more independence in the decision-making process, and we need the ability for scientists to appeal decisions to independent decision makers. Secondly, the policies themselves, as I noted before, I think were written with a failure of imagination, I'll just say again, in the ways that, in terms of how things have played out today. So the idea that a scientific integrity policy would prohibit an actual violation but not an attempted violation, I think is a very big shortcoming. It's sort of like having a world in which attempted murder is not a crime, but murder is. I think we could all agree that is not an effective prevention against homicide. So yeah, I think there's a lot of holes in the scientific integrity policies as they currently stand. I will say that they were a big step forward when they were written. They all started more or less from a 2009 Obama era memorandum, building on some previous work to deal with issues like plagiarism and research misconduct, as I noted. But just this era of censorship and political intimidation and threats, I think we need to do a lot more to catch up with the current reality.
On the other hand, it's their administration. They won the election. Why should they not have the ability to put their own voice in these documents?
Yes, every agency does have the authority to, conduct things as they see fit, and to have policies that are in line with their political goals. I think we can all agree on that, even if we might not like, some of the outcomes from that. But I think the problem with the scientific integrity policies is that they're so manipulatable. And I believe that we should have scientific integrity policies that are robust and evenly enforced no matter who is in charge. So we should have a policy that also prevents censorship and manipulation in a more liberal environment. We should be treating scientists evenly and equally, regardless of what the political party is in power. I'm not saying that we should have one set of policies for a Republican administration, one set of policies for a Democratic administration. I think we should all be held to the same standards.
I can just jump in on that, Dale.
Please.
I think actually President Trump said it best prior to his election during the 2016 campaign. He said, in answer to a question posed by Science Debate about how he would protect scientists, he said, "Science is science and facts are fact." That's a quote. As Lauren said, what you do with the science and how you respond and what policy measures are implemented, that is entirely appropriate for the administration to be weighing in on. But creating alternative facts is quite a different thing.
Maria, did you have something to add there? Okay, so Maria, talk to me briefly about your current status and what this process has done to your career.
It feels like it's ended it right now, quite frankly. I haven't done any more climate research since I lost my job. I mean, when I lost my job, my federal computer was taken away from me, so I can't independently do my research from home. And so the result of that has been really devastating to me and my family. I mean, I've been unemployed since February 2019. That's a lot of income to have lost. I mean, over hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm worried I'm going to lose my house because I stood up for the science, and maybe I shouldn't have done that. That's the real life consequences for any scientist who decides to stand up for it. When you see something wrong going on, it's very nice to think that there are these protections there, but the real life situation is that you could really impact your career in a significant way. So right now I've got this huge gaping hole in my resume. I have applied to literally hundreds of jobs. And the overwhelming response that I seem to get when I interview is a feeling of, well, this was someone who was taking a political stand against an administration, and we're still under that administration right now, and we can't risk hiring this person because we could offend that administration. And I think so many people miss the point. I wasn't taking a stand for a political reason. I was taking a stand for science and facts and reality. And so I think many people muddle in that political element when actually it was more about the ethics of trying to change facts.
So we have a question from the audience, and again, a reminder that if you would put your questions into the Q&A function, and we're happy to respond to them. So the question from Muriel: how might these federal intellectual crimes affect the legal situation in states like California? And I'm not certain how that would play. So if you would, I guess, Romany, maybe perhaps that's best focused toward you.
Lauren, did you want to kick off?
Yeah, I'll kick off. And then I think we've talked obviously about the federal system and the ways in which federal agencies, scientific integrity policies have fallen short. At the state level, there's virtually nothing. We did a fair amount of research on our end to find, even if there was protections at the state level, and there largely isn't, which is disheartening to say the least. We have not, at least in the tracker, caught as many incidents at the state level, and that may just be a result of the fact that state and local journalism is suffering even more than national journalism. But yeah, no, I mean, I think we're seeing the same sorts of incidents all over the country, and at the state level, it's a little harder to see how, there's been less press coverage of the exact way that's played out, but my belief is that this is not something that's limited to the federal government. The Trump administration maybe is sort of the standard bearer in how this has all happened, but it's by no means the only bad actor in all of this. And I think it's worth just noting that, you know, it's not a liberal or a conservative thing exactly. I mean, every presidential administration has done these sorts of things. Even the Obama administration, one of the reasons these policies were implemented was, you know, there were accusations of issues like this in Republican and Democratic administrations. So to suggest that it's just a federal government issue and not a state government issue, I think is also not looking at the full picture.
And that's an important point to note, that this has happened in the past. It happened in Bush administrations. It happened with Obama. I guess the question or the issue here is one of scale.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think Romany can talk about, you know, the state versus local scale that we've seen, or the local and state versus federal scale that we've seen in the tracker as well.
Yeah, I would just add to Lauren's point, you know, when we're thinking about the implications of these actions for, you know, sort of legal and regulatory action, whether it be at the federal level or at the state level, you know, hiding, undermining, restricting the science really does have the potential to weaken the basis for further regulation of greenhouse gas emissions and other climate regulations, which is, of course, a key reason why the Trump administration is targeting the science. You know, it also has sort of, I guess, social implications if the issue is not as much on people's radar, then the sort of push for regulation is weakened. And I think that has implications for federal regulation, but also for state regulation in places like California and New York, where we are seeing states going further. You know, in terms of actual anti-science action at the state level, as Lauren said, we have not documented as widespread anti-science action at the state and local level, but we think that is in part due to information gaps, just things don't come to light as much. And I will echo Lauren's point that this is definitely not a solely Republican or solely Democratic issue. We have seen anti-science action in blue states and red states, including anti-science action in California, which is probably the last place that most people expect.
And to be clear on this, there are no state laws for employment, for instance, with what happened to Maria that would supersede federal jurisdiction over this.
In Maria's case, yeah, I don't want to get deeply into Maria's case.
But in those types of cases,
yeah,
not specifically Maria.
By and large, people like Maria are just left in the ditch. There's a really unfortunate gap that you know, Maria is obviously a figurehead for that almost, but she's not the only one that we've worked with in a situation like that, and she's one of thousands of federal workers who has an employment arrangement like that and would find themselves in a similarly devastating situation where the legal system is just unprepared to deal with the complexities of, you know, how the federal government itself has decided to employ scientists.
So, because there's not been anything major exploding since the debates last night, we can't go that long without something happening. I think it was this morning that it was announced that the administration is going to try and change the rules and guidelines as to who is a protected employee. Did you see that announcement this morning? Either of you? Can you address that? Or so no, you guys haven't seen it either.
I sort of saw a headline. I haven't looked at it in detail, so I'm sort of reluctant to comment, but I would say that it would be entirely on brand for Lauren, and I think it would be very helpful for the administration. And to Lauren's point, I think it would be very helpful for the administration as it moves forward, because, you know, as we heard, a lot of these whistleblower protections and other protections that are put in place don't apply to those sort of contractual employees, and also makes them, of course, easier to get rid of those employees when they say something or object to something that is not in line with what the Trump administration wants or thinks is appropriate.
So why don't we talk more about the tracker, and let's, if you could walk us through it very quickly, just show, there are two things I want to talk about. One is to look at this as a tool for journalists, and two, how they might use it to mine for stories. So what what would be of value to them as they're trying to figure out their entry into this. These are often federal issues. A lot of reporters are looking for local angles that they can use, or regional angles. So anything that we can show them that would be useful to them in that regard would be helpful. So Romany, why don't you bring up the tracker that you've got there?
I'm going to share my screen right now. Hopefully you guys can see that. So this is our Silencing Science Tracker. It is housed on the Sabin Center for Climate Change website, climate.law.columbia.edu. And if you scroll down, you see this sort of table on the homepage, which, as you can see here, includes 462 entries. They are the federal, state, and local government actions. We have them divided into various categories. So the explanation reflects the type of anti-science action, whether it be government censorship, budget cuts, personnel changes. This category here, interference with education, is one we haven't talked about yet, but is really important, relates to mostly state level efforts to change or restrict the way that climate change is taught in schools, and could have really profound implications sort of long term in terms of undermining the scientific literacy of our kids. So that's an important one. But in terms of sort of navigating the site, you can sort by category of anti-science action, you can sort by agency, and it's in this tab that you will see an action called federal, which lists all the federal level actions. And then over here, a state level a state button that lists all the state level actions. And so that is, you know, if you're looking for local stories in your particular state or your particular locality, you can search on that basis. You can also sort of track trends in your state over time and at the federal level over time, and compare different places. So as we've talked about, you know, it's not necessarily a blue state versus red state situation, but there are sort of better performers and worse performers. You know, Texas particularly relatively poor, Wyoming, a few other states that are sort of, I guess, somewhat bad actors. And then the only other thing that I would just point out, two other things. One is the scientist affected category. You know, the tracker includes attacks on climate science, but it also includes other anti-science actions targeting other scientific disciplines. So as Lauren alluded to, we have a lot of entries in there at the moment relating to COVID and restrictions on COVID data being published and related topics. And then the last thing is the keyword filter. If you're looking for a particular place or, you know, researching what's happened to a particular scientist, you can use the filter there. So hopefully that was helpful.
What's the process that you go through to collect this data?
So most of the entries in the tracker are drawn from media sources. So, you know, to some extent, we're kind of trying to raise awareness within the media community about the tracker, but we also need input from them. So, you know, if people have things that they think qualify for inclusion in the story, we would welcome receiving them. We also do some additional research to find things, particularly state and local level entries, looking at, for example, legislative proposals in various states to find those actions in that interference with education category that I talked about, and other sort of searching that we do, trawling through records put together by various scientific organizations and educational organizations.
Okay, so for journalists who are coming to this using the filters, they want to find something that is either in their beat or in their region or their state that they can draw upon then to be able to find more information. Okay, so Sabin Center, what sort of resources do you have for journalists there? Can they call? Are there experts they can talk to when they have questions about these stories? What specific resources do you have available for them?
Yeah, so as I sort of alluded to in my opening remarks, we have a bunch of online resources for journalists and others that are interested in climate issues. We have, I think, about a dozen databases now covering different aspects of climate change law, our Silencing Science Tracker, of course, but also the Climate Deregulation Tracker, the litigation databases. We also have a number of resources that I think are going to become increasingly useful in the future if we see a change in administration and a shakeup in Congress. We have a couple of databases. One is called our Model Laws for Deep Decarbonization, which is basically legislative proposals that we could potentially see adopted in a new Congress to advance various aspects of deep decarbonization. And we also have our newest resource, which is called cdrlaw.org, which looks specifically at carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions technologies. So on top of all those sort of online resources, we have a team of people at the Sabin Center, all of whom are happy and willing to talk to journalists, either just on background or for attribution. You know, we have a great team. Each person sort of specializes in one particular area. So, you know, if people want to reach out to one of us, if we're not the right person, we can definitely direct you to someone who is.
And Lauren, the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, what resources might be available for journalists there?
Yeah, so in terms of the issues that we talked about, we have a scientific integrity page. This link was in the chat again, and I think we can put it back up. And it has our guides to scientific integrity policy, which includes some comparisons about the ways in which various agencies have better and worse policies and whether or not they cover things like scientists' rights to speak to the press, whether or not they consider threats to be a violation of scientific integrity, or it has to be an actually completed act, you know, as Maria's case indicates. And we also have a model language, which we think would be a really helpful step forward in terms of covering all the things that a scientific integrity policy should address. And we have a number of other guides too. Most of them, I have to confess, are more oriented towards scientists. So we have guides for scientists who want to become more politically active, how they can do so, being, you know, more involved in matters before Congress without violating anti-lobbying laws. That's unfortunately a thing that scientists have been accused of doing. You know, scientists who want to get involved in this current election, what they can do. So we have all sorts of resources like that that are designed to be educational. In terms of journalists, it is a little bit of a tricky needle thread because most of the scientists we work with are not like Maria and don't want to talk about what's happened to them. And it's a bit of a challenge because, especially if they are still employed by, say, the federal government, you know, they have, I think, very valid concerns about, you know, what the risks might be in terms of speaking out. I believe that at least some of them, you know, if there's a change in administration, may feel a little bit more able to take risks like that. But as it currently stands, it's a little bit of a challenge. I think one piece of advice I would have for journalists on that is if you're able to talk to a scientist on background or off the record, you can at least get information and get the picture of what's happening, even if the scientist is not able to, you know, give you a quote or specifically identify themselves in relation to the story you're writing. There was a piece that came out a few months ago in the New York Times by Lisa Friedman, and she did talk to quite a few scientists, and I think it was helpful in that she was able to limit the amount that was publicly available about who had spoken to her and on what stories. And I think, you know, the more that journalists are able to be nuanced about those sorts of issues, the more scientists will be able to talk to them about what's happened.
So Maria, can you talk a little bit about you've obviously dealt with a lot of journalists through this process. Can you talk a little bit about what advice you would give to journalists on how to deal with people who are going through the situation?
Yeah, and there's an interesting kind of journalism thread to my story, which was, so the reason my story became so public was I spoke to a journalist called Elizabeth Sjogren, who ran a 1-hour piece by Reveal on NPR, kind of detailing everything that I went through. And so she was someone that I had initially spoken to in 2013, just for a very bland kind of 5-minute piece that was going to be on NPR. And so she knew the timeline of my project. And so while I was on maternity leave and encountering all this pushback and intimidation to edit my report, she randomly reached out to me just to say, hey, I know the timeline of your project and you're a year behind when you're meant to have released this report. Do you have any kind of comment or anything you can tell us about that? And if it had just been a reporter that had emailed me out of the blue, had said, hey, you're behind schedule, perhaps I wouldn't have even bothered replying to that email. But because I had established that relationship with Elizabeth back in 2013, I knew her to be an honest reporter, to be very ethical, someone who, if you spoke to them, say off the record, that they would respect that. And so I think that even if we move to an administration that might not be so public about their scientific integrity violations or whatever, I think it's still very valuable for journalists to establish those relationships with scientists early on in their careers so that we can figure out who the trusted ones are and who aren't. Because quite frankly, I've also spoken to other reporters from very prestigious organizations, from other reporting outlets, who have not respected my wishes that some things be off the record. And so I've also learned which reporters not to speak to ever again because they're not respecting my wishes so well. So I've certainly had a real learning, a big lesson in the media that I never had before. I was just a scientist in an office doing my job. I never imagined my life would be like this, but I've learned a lot about how the media works through all of this process.
This is a problem that I've seen often with journalists, and it's this conversation about what's on the record and what's off the record. And journalists, many of them have very, very specific rules, but it's become such common knowledge to them. It becomes assumed knowledge. They think everybody else understands that, and they don't. Most journalists, or at least many journalists, believe that anytime you're talking to a reporter, unless they tell you it's off the record, it's on the record. I always found that to be difficult when I was reporting, but a lot of people sort of believe that. And I think you have to be very clear as a journalist, and I think this is an important thing to understand. You have to be very clear on what you regard as deep background, off the record. Most people as sources have no concept what that means. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that was a difficulty for you. They may have been purposely trying to go against your wishes, but there may have been simply an understanding of what was on and off the record.
Well, in my one particular case where someone said something that was meant to be off the record, she actually pulled out a notebook and said, oh, okay, this is going to be off the record. And I saw her write down off the record and start taking a list. And she still used it. And in fact, in that particular, it was a radio piece. You can hear me whispering to her in that moment because I was trying to avoid being picked up by the microphone, but it still picked me up on the microphone while I was whispering, basically reading an email to her, and she used it. Whereas to contrast it with Elizabeth, who is so good about trying to clarify what's on and off the record, sometimes because this was an evolving story so she spoke to me several times over many months. Sometimes I would blurt things out because it was almost like a friendship. And she would say, wait a minute, do you want this to be on the record? And I'd go, no, actually, no, I don't. So that was, that was certainly an interesting lesson to learn about how the media works. Even when I'm trying to be explicit sometimes, I've learned that, you think something's going to be off the record, it's not necessarily going to be off the record. So that's taught me a lesson not to even say it. And as to go back to my previous point, I had that relationship with Elizabeth from 2013. I knew her to be a very ethical and honest reporter. And so when she asked me for a comment, I felt like I could give her a much more honest representation of what's going on compared to someone who, if they just emailed me out of the blue in 2018, I perhaps would just say, no comment, let's move on. I have nothing to say.
And this gets back to your initial and your main point of establishing relationships, because part of establishing relationships is trust and awareness of what the guidelines are. So we have another question, this one from Tessa Lee, directed to you, Maria. Is there anything you would have liked to do different?
No, not as far as actions go. I don't regret anything that I did. Some people have asked me before, how long did it take me to decide that this should be a scientific integrity violation? Did I have to deliberate over that? And no, it was instantaneous. I know right from wrong. I knew something wrong was going on. And so I did that. But one thing I think I would like perhaps to have done differently was to also try and raise awareness more of this issue about contract scientists. It wasn't until I testified to Congress that I realized so few people realized that this is a problem. I had a congressman say that I was a contractor. And when I said, no, I'm actually a partner for the National Park Service, he had no idea what that role was. And so I wish in speaking to the media, I could have maybe shone more of a light onto that issue. That's the only thing I think I would have done differently.
So Lisa Friedman has written about how quickly the views of Trump appointees have trickled down to middle managers and how quickly they've taken on that persona or that guidance. Is this either Romani or Lauren, is this typical in administration, or is this something that seems to feel different?
I'll take a first crack at this. Well, we did not run the tracker in previous administrations, and while I wish we had, I don't have actual data to compare. The moment anyway, I will say that, just looking at resources that other groups have put together, like Union of Concerned Scientists, it does seem that the widespread efforts, not by political appointees, but by, middle managers, as you say, is just an order of magnitude bigger. It really does seem extremely pervasive. Is that because people always wanted to be this way, or because they feel pressured to be this way? I mean, there's some ambiguity, I think, about what exactly is motivating people, but my personal belief is that it's fear. So yeah, I don't think we've seen anything quite like this in previous administrations. It's just different in how it's played out. It's always been an issue, but this is just a completely different scenario.
Yeah, I also think, as Lauren said, we don't have hard data for previous administrations. And, for someone like me who's an academic, I don't like to speak without that data. But, I think numerous reports have shown that it is much more widespread within the Trump administration than it has been in previous administrations. The other thing is that it's really kind of a different type of attack on science almost. Whereas those past administrations really tried to hide the extent to which they were censoring or restricting scientific research, the Trump administration has made no such attempt. President Trump himself, his senior officials, Wheeler, Pruitt, others, have been very vocal, I think, in their opposition to science, their questioning of science. I think we saw that perhaps most obviously with the National Climate Assessment that came out, and then, almost every relevant cabinet appointee said it's unbelievable, it's untrustworthy, we shouldn't be listening to this, and it's their own report. So I think that is a marked difference from previous administrations. And I think that really sets the tone for how others within the government view science and the role of science, and does create, to Lauren's point, this culture of fear within a lot of these agencies.
All right, we've got a few minutes left, so why don't we move into the future, and let's bring out the crystal balls and speculate a little bit. Let's start first. If it's a Trump victory in less than 2 weeks, what do you see happening over the next 4 years? Either one of you who wants to go first.
I'll take an initial crack at this. One thing, as I noted before, it's not just about who wins the White House, but also what happens in Congress. I think if there's a shakeup in the Senate, we may actually still see some progress on improving the laws related to how scientific integrity is regulated. Right now, there's no actual legislation that requires these policies in place. It would be great to see Congress pass such a thing. And I know that the House has been working on this, and they actually have a pretty popular bill at the moment. So if it passed the House and the Senate, I think that would be a wonderful step, even if the administration situation doesn't change. Another thing that would happen if Congress gets a bit of a switch up is that we would finally get some quorum on the Merit System Protection Board. There has not been a quorum on this major board that looks at whistleblower policies since January 2017. They just do not have the people in the seats to adjudicate these claims. And if the Senate actually were able to appoint people in the Merit Systems Protection Board, that would alleviate a huge backlog and would actually let us address some of these issues. So it's not just about Trump, but let's say everything stays exactly the same. I mean, I think that looks pretty grim, I have to be honest. As Romany noted earlier, I think that they've learned some lessons about how they've approached issues, and I think we could honestly expect it to get worse. I think a lot of career folks who worked very hard to combat a lot of what we've seen have been atrophied out, either because they got fed up and left, or because they got fired or moved somewhere else. So the status quo, I think, is a pretty grim scenario. I have to say it would be frustrating for sure.
Yeah, I'll just add, if we look broader than just sort of the science landscape, the climate science landscape, thinking about the regulatory landscape, of course, the Trump administration doesn't have a sort of, or the Trump campaign doesn't have a sort of policy paper on what it'll do on climate change. We look at the statements that Trump and others in his administration have made. I think we expect more of the same on the regulatory front, continued support for fossil fuels, going back and fixing those regulatory actions that they've already tried and failed at, strengthening a lot of those and moving forward with a lot of those. But also I think a few things that might be new to people. So one is thinking about sort of federal-state interactions. The Trump administration often likes to say that the states should decide issues in the environment space. But actually, when you look at their statements, they only like the state to decide where the state's decision is in line with what they would decide. So recently, Wheeler has made some statements criticizing New York and California and other pro-climate states and suggesting that he would look at ways to sort of rein in those states. Also, thinking about sort of regulatory process, we have things like the secret science rule that some people will be familiar with that sort of seeks to restrict the use of science in regulatory processes. I think we can see more of those sorts of more subtle, but equally, if not more damaging sorts of acts.
And quickly then, if we can talk about what happens if it's a Biden win in November. Romany?
I think the landscape looks very different, both on the science side and the regulatory side. Of course, no administration is perfect, but I do think we can expect to see Biden looking to undo many of the Trump administration's regulatory actions.
And how easy is that? How easy is it to do that?
I mean, it takes time. A lot of those actions, as I said, have been finalized. So the Biden administration would have to go through a new notice and proposal, accept public comment, then they finalize it. So it takes time. They have to have an appropriate basis and analysis to support the new position. So it's not, just rip up the regulations that Trump's adopted, but it can be done. And then beyond that, of course, just reinstating what we had before isn't enough. So it will be up to the Biden administration to really look at new regulatory actions if we have the shakeup in Congress, to look at the potential for legislative action. And I think, on the regulatory side, in terms of sort of controlling climate change, but also on the science side, some of the things that Lauren was talking about with the scientific integrity laws and strengthening those policies, things like that.
The 64 regulations and policies or so that have been blocked in the courts, though, there's little to be done. Those policies are still in play, right? They're already in place. They've not been overturned as Trump has tried because they're under challenge. So
it's a mixed bag. So in some cases, the courts have stayed the Trump administration rollback, prevented it taking effect. In some cases, the court proceedings are still playing out. Where there are those ongoing court proceedings, the Biden administration could go in and ask the courts to hold off while they relook at it, could not defend those Trump administration rules. There's certainly things to be done. The primary problem, I think, is time. We don't have a lot of time, and all these things, because you have to go through those procedural steps, take time.
And Lauren, your thoughts on a Biden presidency?
Yeah, I'll just agree with Romany that I don't think we can expect perfection. I think we can definitely anticipate still having issues, but I would very much like to see reforms on the scientific integrity front, as I've said before. The Biden administration has not really talked about these issues. He has said that he will believe the scientists. And I would like to think that that also means empowering the scientists. But I think on the scientific integrity front, it's a little bit of an open question as to how exactly they would tackle this issue of making sure that we can prevent against the worst of what we've already seen.
What we've seen, though, is almost a sense of ease in making these changes. Is there any long-term solution? The Scientific Integrity Act challenges or addresses a particular issue, but is there any longer-term solutions that can take the politics out of science policy, or is this, at least at some level, something we have to expect because it's government and government's messy?
I think those are both true. I think science and politics are always going to be very uneasy bedfellows. I wish that was not the case, and I think a lot of scientists feel the same way, but I think it's just a reality. But I also think that there are things that we could do to help insulate science more. Those sorts of reforms that I've talked about, I think would be a big step in the right direction. And some other things that I didn't get into quite so much that I also think are very much worth reforming. So the Whistleblower Protection Act does have some protections against speaking out against scientific censorship, but they are limited. Their application to contractors is difficult, and the ability to apply them in situations like someone actually contesting a scientific integrity violation is fuzzy. So I think we could do a lot more just to help scientists who want to be whistleblowers be protected as well.
So one last thing, all three of you or none of you have to respond, but is there any one question or two questions that as journalists move forward in this realm that you think they should be asking? What is the one or two things that you think are most significant for? It might be what they should be investigating, it might be the kinds of people they talk to, it might be just a question they ask that guides them through this process.
I'll take a first stab at this. I would really love to have more conversations about solutions. I think we've had some really wonderful coverage of all of the various issues that we've seen, and there's honestly more to be talked about too. I think, as I noted before, if there's a change in administration, I think more scientists will be comfortable speaking about what happened to them. But, I am a solutions-oriented person, and I would love us to be having a more robust national conversation about how to prevent these sorts of issues happening again. And I think that can take a lot of different angles. I mean, there's all the things that I've discussed and that Romany have discussed, obviously, but how can we improve the education system in this country? How can we help people do more critical thinking and things like that? How really, create progress that is meaningful and lasting.
Romany?
Yeah, I second everything Lauren says. I do think the education piece is really under-recognized and under-reported on. These attacks on education are absolutely devastating, particularly given that the youth movement has been so important in pushing for climate action. So I think that's one area. The other thing I would say is, thinking beyond the specific action at issue, making clear that this is part of a broader phenomenon that is really, to our knowledge, unprecedented, and thinking about why that matters. Not to trivialize in any way Maria's individual story, but that's part of a larger story that we really need to get out there.
Maria, you may not have anything to add here, but I want to give you the opportunity if in case you do.
No, I mean, to build on what Romany just said, I mean, I think that's a story. My particular case is just one example of what's happening to these contract scientists. But in my particular department, for example, I mean, I know of at least 100 people that are under contract. And so I think that that's a story that needs further pursuit of how they're basically abusing their employees, because they know that we have no protections. And so we can't really speak out in that way. But also, if I may add, one question that I would like people to ask, I would actually like people to stop asking anyone they're interviewing if they believe climate change is real. I would really appreciate it if we could stop asking that question and maybe replace it with, do you understand the climate science instead? Because knowing about climate change does not take an act of faith. It's just an act of knowledge. And so I would really appreciate it if journalists could change the way they phrase that question.
Changing the framing. Thank you. Maria, I am particularly grateful for you for joining us and spending time. I know it must be difficult to constantly be reminded of what you've gone through, and I'm grateful that you're willing to share that. Lauren, Romani, thank you both so much for being with us. And for the journalists watching, thank you as well. A process note for you. A video of this webinar will be posted next week at some point at the Earth Institute blog. It's called State of the Planet. The address is blogs.ei.columbia.edu. That's blogs.ei.columbia.edu, or just search Columbia and State of the Planet. Along with the video of this session, I will include a blog post, and there will be links to resources and, importantly, some story ideas you can use to begin your coverage of this issue. I hope you'll check it out and also look at the other videos that make up the Resilience Media Project. The Resilience Media Project is a part of Andy Revkin's new initiative at the Earth Institute called Sustain What. Sustain What is a global conversation focused on identifying concrete solutions to the complicated challenges of humanity today. Our primary focus is on making sense of the changes impacting our Earth and biological systems. In light of the outbreak of COVID-19, the main focus of our sessions is also on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by the pandemic and teaching journalists how to better respond to these issues. At the same time, we're also focusing on ways to build more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable communities in the years ahead. You can check out Andy's program as well as mine at the Earth Institute website. My thanks to all of our guests and to you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you again at a future program. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.